We're going to talk about fixed perspective, original capture, composite photography. Specifically, in this case, we'll be having one subject appear multiple times in the same scene. Just to overview terms quickly, a composite photograph is simply a photograph where multiple pictures are merged together to create a new image, which could be something as simple as placing a cloudy sky into an otherwise stark landscape, or more extreme instances like putting an entirely new, even surreal object into a scene like a baby hanging from a skyscraper, or in some cases using extra background information to remove someone from a scene, like perhaps a family member that's fallen out of favor in a family picture, though I wouldn't actually condone that type of photography. Original capture simply refers to the fact that images are made with your camera. So the maker of the image who's merging the images together is the same person who made the images through their camera. So we're not talking about downloading images or pulling images out of books or anything like that. Fixed perspective refers to the fact that the camera does not move for this process, and I will come back to that in just a moment. Before describing that, I'd like to point out that doing composite photographs as an exercise is really equally useful whether you're aspiring to make composite images as your ultimate artistic output, or even if you're more interested in spontaneous, candid compositions. For the former, the advantages of this exercise are obvious because you're picking up directly applicable skills for that process. But even for an aspiring documentary photographer, knowing how to make composite images is very helpful for a number of reasons. Two important ones which come to mind are it will give you a more precise sense of where you place objects in your frame, which will give you a much stronger sense of composition. And also, by making composite images, you'll train your eye to detect composite photography more easily. And if you're working as a photojournalist or documentary photographer, it can be really helpful to spot if images have been doctored as a photographer or even as an editor for some sort of publication. And beyond that, just being, not even a photographer, but just a person in the world, I think that learning composite photography and learning photo manipulation is almost a crucial skill because it allows you to see it where it's done, and it's done everywhere so much. And I think being sensitive to it improves photo literacy and will just give you a better sense of what's going on around you and what people are trying to tell you in pictures. So coming back to the fixed perspective, that simply means that the camera does not move. So you've got one scene and objects within that scene change. This offers some compositional limitations because everything has to be photographed in one place and usually in a finite amount of time. But as you'll see later in this demonstration, it makes the post-production aspect of putting these images together extremely easy. So just talking about the camera end of things, it's pretty simple. Essentially, you want everything set to manual and you want everything to be fixed. So manual focus, manual shutter speed, manual aperture, and of equal importance, manual ISO. It's also crucial that your camera is fixed in one position, preferably with a tripod. If you're trying to make images like this and you don't have a tripod, this can be easily gotten around. You can improvise by simply putting your camera on a stable surface. I should point out though that if you're putting your camera on a stable surface, you should set the drive mode to self-timer, which means when you press the button, you'll have between 2 and 10 seconds before the shutter goes off. The reason for that is, as you can see, the camera can easily wiggle around when pushing the button itself, which will cause your images to misalign. And you can even do this on a tripod. If you are improvising, another thing that can be quite useful is to actually use a book or something with a straight edge to try to maintain perfect alignment in case your camera moves a little bit between shots. Even if you are using a tripod, it's very common that the frame will move a little bit, and that's okay. So in the simplest form of composite photography, I can have myself over here, and then I can have myself over here. As you'll see when we get to the post-processing aspect, putting these images together is very simple. So I'm going to want a little more from you in terms of what you produce with these pictures, and you should want that from yourself too, of course. One way to make it a little more interesting is you could have a scene, for instance, with a narrative to it. So here I am pouring tea, and on this side I'm leaning on the table, and let me get that lined up, receiving the tea that's being poured. So here I'm appearing twice in the same frame, but there's more to it than that. I have an interaction between my two subjects. You may have noticed in this scene I put together that while I have the tea pouring into the cup, I didn't have any overlap with myself. It's possible to have subjects overlapping in the frame, but especially for your first try at this, try not to have any of your multiplied subjects overlap in the frame. So if that means keeping them on one side and then the other, so be it. Or you can even make simple sketches and look at your previous shot to avoid that overlap. So to take this idea of narrative in the composite frame a little bit further, we're going to try to have time proceed through one space. So we'll have a sequence of images telling a simple narrative, but that narrative will then be put into one scene. So for our first narrative, we're going with a simple story of falling in love, having a fight, breaking up. So here our characters played by Hassan and Elise share a nice moment, a giggle together. In the next image, our characters are clearly fighting. And in the third image, we have the sadness that follows the separation, though Elise seems pretty cool with it. Now, as a 3-frame sequence, this works pretty well, but for this project, we're going to put this all together into one space like this. And just to clarify, this is actually how the scene was shot to be. For our next demo, Hao and Dahan hatch a plan to film a jump by the trains. They then film the jump, and after that they look at their clip together. And this also will come together into one image. Here you can see the angle of view where I took the shot with the green lines representing the boundaries of what the camera sees. And now you can see shot 1, shot 2, and shot 3. If you watch the video of the photo shoot, you'll see it begins with me running around showing people where to stand and then kind of taking some time to tweak people into place for each shot. It's really important for these kinds of shots to be really clear where you want subjects to stand, because you have to remember they can't see what you see through the camera. Once you've finished making photographs, the post-production process to put 3 subjects in the same frame is relatively simple. The first thing you'll want to do is to import your pictures the way you normally would, and then to take all the pictures you've made and add them to a collection with the name of the assignment or the project that you're working on. So I will call this 3 of a kind and create. Now, the main reason to create a collection in this case is simply to keep the work better organized. So now I will review through my pictures and star the pictures using the number keys on the keypad that I want to use. So here I have Tahan and Hao are hatching their plan, so I'll definitely want to use that one. So I'll give that one 2 stars. Perhaps for the jumping, I'm not sure which one I want to use yet, so I'll give all these jumping scenes with Tahan photographing Hao jumping over the track 1 star, and then maybe here where they're reviewing the image they just made, I'll select all of these that seem somewhat appealing. So reviewing between these, I definitely like this expression that's going on here on Hao's face. Let's see when that comes in crisp. So I think I'll definitely use that one. So I'll upgrade that one to 2 stars. This one less interesting, so I'll just leave that. And then here with the jump, I think that this is the keeper. So now that I've given my 3 images each their proper rating, I go down here to filter and I'll filter for 2 stars. So now I just have 3 images listed here. Now you can see that the images move ever so slightly. Also the sky moves ever so slightly because time is passing, but I think that we should be able to make all that work. So using this image, I'm going to make some tonal adjustments to this scene. I'm going to use Tahan's scarf as our neutral gray point, which you can see gives us a much nicer, warmer light that looks a lot more natural to the light we had. I'll also boost the clarity just a hair, maybe bring down the highlights a little so we can see that sky. This looks like a big piece of dust in my camera. So I will use the spot tool, see if I can effectively move that out. I will also go down to the lens correction tool, which I seem to have forgotten. Here it is. And it looks like our correction for this lens is already enabled. I'll also see, I think I may have seen some hints of chromatic aberration. It's very subtle, but you can see like a little glow, little red line going down there. Honestly, it doesn't really matter if you see it or not. You can just hit remove chromatic aberrations because just if you don't see it now, just because you don't see it now doesn't mean that you won't see it later. I might even, for the final image, I might want to drop the exposure, but because I want to set these up to work as layers in Photoshop, my goal now is less about having the perfect contrast and more about just having as much information as possible. So I've lightened the shadows so I see all the information in Hao's outfit. And I might even boost the vibrance just a touch so I have a little extra color to work with. So having made those adjustments, I'll now highlight the other 3 images and go to this option to synchronize. And I really want to synchronize everything. I worked on white balance, I worked on tonal adjustments, I did a lens correction, I even did a spot removal. So I'm just going to check all and synchronize. And what I'm going to double check with these other images is to see that the spot removal over that chimney in the background worked properly in all 3 images, and it did. So having done basic adjustments on these images, I will now highlight the 3 images and simply right-click on them and choose this option here, Edit In, Sub-Option, Open as Layers in Photoshop. So having brought the images into Photoshop as layers, the first thing I'm going to do is just hit Command 0 or Control 0 on Windows, and that simply will zoom in the image so it fills the screen.
so I can see the whole image and I can see my tools. Now here, if I turn the eyes off on the layers, especially if I focus on the train, I can see that the scene seems to twist back and forth. And here it seems to even move up and down a bit. So while I was using a tripod, the scene is very windy, which you can see by Tahan and Hao's hair, so a little bit of camera movement was inevitable. To compensate for this, we're simply going to select all our layers here by selecting the bottom layer, and then I will hold down Shift and click on the top layer. All three are selected, and now I will go to the Edit menu and choose this option, Auto Align Layers. Now I'm just going to use the default projection mode, and we can discuss what projection modes are perhaps at another time when discussing panoramic stitching. So I'll just take the default and click OK. So now that the layers are aligned, you'll see that while the subjects move, that sign, for instance, or the train just stays right in place. So you may wonder if this negates the need for a tripod. In some cases, if you're not actually staging your subjects and you're able to make your photographs in a very short phase of time, then you may be able to get away with just holding a stable position, shooting handheld, and compensating for these issues here. But I think you'll find that if you try to shoot this handheld, that the discrepancies between the framing will be much greater than the little bit of movement that can happen with a tripod. So the next stage is we're going to put layer masks on the top layers, or maybe better described as all the layers except the one at the bottom of the list. And layer masks are created with this button. I'll zoom in on it so we can really take a moment to focus on it. Rectangle with a circle in the middle. If it helps you to remember, you can think layer mask looks like the Japanese flag, or the Bangladeshi flag is also a circle in the middle. So when I click this layer mask option, as you can see, nothing happens. And that is because our layer mask here is white. So just to talk a little bit about masks, I'm going to hide the other two layers and select a brush tool. And I'm going to set that brush to black. So you can see as I brush across the image, it's as if I'm erasing it. And we also see that black line represented in the mask, like this. The benefit of using a mask instead of erasing is that I can switch this brush back to white, and there's this great tool here to switch between black and white quickly, erase. So it's non-destructive, a non-destructive way to remove and replace elements in the scene. Now, what I want to work with here, I'm going to put these layers back, are black masks. Rather than cutting holes through the pictures, I want to bring elements in. So I'm going to invert this mask, which should just make the layer disappear. If you work on the image itself, invert will have a very different result. Now I can skip this step of inverting the mask altogether by simply holding the Option or Alt key while clicking on the mask tool, which will just create a black mask. So for this process in making a composite picture, the crucial thing is to remember you're working on your masks, you're never selecting the images themselves. I can zoom in on this so we can see that a little better. So here's selected on the mask, here's selected on the image. And we want to work from the bottom up. And I will come back to that in a moment to demonstrate why. So we know that our subject is in the middle for the middle frame and all the way to the left for the left frame. So having selected the mask, having selected a white brush, I can simply brush our subjects into these scenes. And you can see I'm being a little bit careful, but not even really that careful. So here I think they're somewhere around here, and there they are. And there we have it, all subjects put together on this scene. Once here, we want to go to File and Save. And let me just point out, not Save As, just Save. The reason that we simply save and don't use the Save As option is that by simply saving, we will see the Photoshop file nested right alongside one of the original files we worked on in Lightroom. Moving on with this file, we'll want to crop out these white edges, which are a result of auto-aligning the layer. So we'll simply use the crop tool, make sure that this little lock here is locked, which means our aspect ratio is maintained, and we'll just crop in that little bit to get rid of those edges. And if we wanted to make other edits to the image, we could here. So I think I made the shadows a little too light, so I might bring down the shadows a little bit, maybe even bring down the blacks a little bit to enhance contrast. Maybe a slightly more advanced adjustment is I'll go here to the luminance panel and darken blues and aquatones to give the sky a little more punch. Perhaps even in the effects panel, I might add a slight vignette to this image. Having made those adjustments, I would then go back to Library and simply export the file, naming it accordingly, so that it is ready to upload or perhaps even print. It is important when working on the Photoshop file to work on the masks from the bottom up. And I'm going to take a moment to demonstrate why by resetting these masks, and also to go over a few other problems that might come up. So our masks are reset. We have black masks on our layers. Something I didn't show before is if you forget where your object is in the layer, you can quickly use the Command-I key, which will invert your mask from black and white, so I can quickly see what is on my next image. One common mistake people will make, regardless of the order in which you work on your masks, is to accidentally be selected on the image instead of the mask. Now, if you are selected on the image, what will happen is you'll be brushing away and it won't seem to have any effect at all. But when you do finally figure out what's happened and start working on the mask, this is what you will start to uncover. And the reason for this is that rather than drawing on your mask, you've actually drawn directly on the image here. I will step back. A little tip is if you use Control Alt or Command Option Z, you can actually step back through your mistakes rather than undoing and redoing them each time. So assuming you are working correctly on the mask, another issue that can come up is working in the wrong order. So when working on these images, you always want to go from the bottom up. In this case, I'm going to show the problem with going from the top down. So here, I can brush these characters in, but I carelessly have brushed a little too far. So I can see this mistake right away and flip my brush to black, clean it up, no problem. What I can't see is that I've also brushed in front of this middle layer. So when I start trying to bring this layer in, you can see it sort of comes in, but no matter how much I brush here, nothing happens. And that's because if I were to remove layers, this is what is in front, this is what's in the middle, and this is what's behind. The lovely thing about this technique, though, is if you do go in the right order, so working from the bottom up in your stack, and here I'm only working with 3 images, but there isn't really any limit on how many you can work with for this. I can bring these in so simply. The masks don't need to be precise. If characters cast shadows along the ground, I can simply brush those shadows in as well. And you can see if I remove the background that these masks are in fact quite crude, that show these different parts of the picture, but it just doesn't matter because the background is perfectly aligned. It is important, though, to keep track of the fact that the background will move in some areas no matter how hard you try to avoid it. Like, for instance, here you can see the clouds have moved and pushed that airplane contrail or long skinny cloud, whatever it is, has actually moved in the sky. So I've avoided brushing in the sky. The beauty of this is, though, how we haven't needed to use any selection tools. Had we had any of our subjects overlap in front of each other, then selection tools would be necessary. When working on making these images, it's really important to go into your photo shoot with a plan. In this photo shoot featuring Domine as the model, we have a lot of interesting positions. Our figure shows up at different depths, which is interesting, and we even have this sort of blurred jump. But the problem here is there's no purpose that connects these characters together. There's no sense of narrative sequence, which is really what we're going for with these. In the case of this image, we have a progression here showing the different stages of creating a paper crane, but the actor in this picture, Shireen, doesn't really play a role in the story. Yes, I know that she's the one who made this object, but the way it's photographed, she's kind of just holding it each time. There's nothing about her role in this picture that really gives any logic to the fact that she repeats. In fact, this would probably be more useful in understanding the progression of a paper crane if this nice green paper was just folding in a black space. This photograph, which was done in class, we kind of came up with a silly but fun story to go with for this. Here we have our photographer character, played by Alicia, who has been photographing some sort of architectural detail, but looks back to notice this lonely, hooded character. And upon unmasking him, upon pulling back the hood, realizes that this is just the model she's been looking for. So then in our final frame, we have Alicia pose with her camera and Ben leaning against the wall as her model. I'm just gonna fine-tune that with a small brush so I don't go over the bag too much. While it is good to have some sense of narrative, things can also get too complicated. In this scene here, it starts with friends walking downstairs with an umbrella. The umbrella is passed between friends, played by Claire and Emily, and here Claire asks Emily, or at least that's who she thinks it is, where is my umbrella? Emily's perhaps a different person because she's wearing a different jacket. And in the final image, we have the reveal that the person in the jacket was in fact Emily's twin. Now, there is an interesting consistency of seeing the umbrella move through the space, but the narrative is far too complicated to really make sense of in this scene. One of my favorite images that was done as a demo is actually this one. We have this scene at the top of the frame. This character, played by Caroline, passes this woman, played by Lucy, a yellow jacket. In the next frame, we simply see her walking down the stairs with the jacket, and in the third frame, putting the jacket around the man at the bottom of the stairs, played by Miller. Now, the thing that I really like about this image is that while I've just told you the story in one direction, there's no reason to think that she hasn't taken the jacket and given it to Caroline. I suppose that her direction on the staircase here does give some implication that the story moves from the top down, but there is nevertheless an ambiguity here. And I think perhaps the best stories that can be told using this composite method of having your subject appear multiple times in the same frame, perhaps the best stories that can be told are stories that can be told forwards or backwards.